You know, when you think about a monumental legacy in cinema, there's usually a very specific image that comes to mind, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
You picture the quintessential cinematic titan,
Yeah,
someone prestigious, polished.
exactly. Like the legendary filmmaker who revolutionized Hollywood, the visionary who orchestrated The Godfather and somehow survived the absolute epic madness of Apocalypse Now.
Right. A figure who seems just, entirely removed from the gritty, unglamorous realities of everyday commerce.
Yeah, but looking through the sources we have today for this deep dive, that polished image just completely shatters.
It really does.
Because the exact same visionary who directed those cinematic holy grails is, well, he's the very same guy who started his career literally splicing together softcore nudie-cutie films to pay his rent.
Yeah.
He's also the guy who directed the critically panned Robin Williams comedy Jack. You know, the one where a 10-year-old ages 4 times too fast?
Oh, yeah. I remember that one.
And maybe most surprising of all, he is the guy who eventually launched his own cannabis brand, cheekily packaged inside a mock black wine bottle.
It is just a staggering series of contradictions. I mean, you have the highest of high art sitting right next to the most unabashed survivalist commerce.
And that is exactly the core of our deep dive today. We are taking the sources you shared, and we're looking right past the Oscars, past the red carpets, and past the whole mafia mythology.
Right.
The mission for you, listening right now, is to explore the mechanics of Francis Ford Coppola's life. We want to understand a relentless risk-taker whose career is essentially, well, it's a high-stakes business case study.
It really is.
We're going to look at how a man built massive cinematic empires, lost them completely to the Hollywood banking system, and then engineered this brilliant, entirely unconventional way to rebuild his life on his own terms.
And, to understand the mechanisms driving that kind of chaotic, massive ambition later in his career, we actually have to look at the severe restrictions of his early life.
Okay, so where do we start?
It all starts with a young boy in Queens, New York, trapped in a bedroom.
I'm assuming you're talking about the polio diagnosis. The sources mention he was bedridden for large chunks of his childhood.
Exactly.
So how does that physical isolation, wire a future director's brain?
Well, it fundamentally creates a need for absolute environmental control. I mean, when you're a kid stuck in bed and you cannot physically explore the outside world, you have to manufacture a world you can manipulate.
Right.
So he turned to homemade puppet theaters. He started taking 8mm home movies and editing them into little features with these grand titles like The Rich Millionaire.
Oh, wow, even back then.
Yeah. And he was academically mediocre, attending 23 different schools.
Wait, 23? That's insane.
It is. But his real obsession was always with how things worked, the mechanics of creation. His childhood nickname was literally Science.
Science. That's great. So he isn't just watching stories, he's engineering them. Yes. He's building miniature universes where he gets to play God because his actual universe is just confined to a mattress.
And that is the genesis of his entire directing philosophy. But the crucial pivot in his methodology happens later, when he's at Hofstra University.
Okay.
He was initially pursuing theater, but he ends up seeing Sergei Eisenstein's 1928 silent film, October.
Yeah.
10 days that shook the world.
And what's the specific mechanism there? Why does a Soviet silent film completely change his trajectory?
It introduces him to the power of montage.
Yeah, montage theory.
Yeah, Eisenstein was a pioneer of Soviet montage theory, which is the idea that you can create profound emotional impact, not just by what you film, but by how you collide different, sometimes unrelated pieces of film together in the editing room.
Interesting.
For Coppola, this was a revelation. It meant the power of cinema wasn't just on the stage with the actors. The true power was in the assembly. He realized you could manipulate human psychology purely through editing.
Okay, but I'm trying to reconcile this really high-minded Soviet film theory with his actual survival days at UCLA in the early 1960s.
Right.
Because the sources say he was making the equivalent of maybe $100 a week today. He is completely broke. So how does montage theory apply to a broke film student?
Well, it applies because montage theory teaches you how to salvage garbage and turn it into a narrative.
Ah.
Really.
Uh-huh.
Coppola looked around and saw his film school peers making quick cash shooting cheap erotic films. No explicit acts, just nudity. So he writes a 12-minute voyeur comedy called The Peeper.
But the buyers reject it because it's too funny, right? Which is just a hilarious critique of a softcore film.
Yeah.
They think the cartoonish comedy will alienate the adult theater audience.
Exactly, which leaves him with all this useless footage. But then a small production company offers him $500.
Okay.
They have a show, entirely separate erotic Western called The Wide Open Spaces. They tell Coppola to just mash his 12-minute comedy into this discarded Western.
Oh, wow.
And using those montage principles,
Colliding unrelated pieces of film.
exactly, colliding those pieces to manufacture a new story.
Mm-hmm.
He re-edits the whole thing and releases it as Tonight for Sure in 1962.
Here's where it gets really interesting to me. We often romanticize film directors as these pure artists waiting for a muse.
Right.
But Coppola's early hustle is much closer to, like, a scrappy Silicon Valley startup founder coding in a garage, right? Like a mechanic building a race car out of junkyard scraps.
That's a great analogy.
He didn't wait for studio gatekeepers to hand him a pristine script. He realized early on that if you know how to assemble the pieces, you can just force your way into the industry using whatever discarded assets are lying around.
And what's fascinating here is how that exact salvage skill set is what catches the eye of Roger Corman.
The legendary B-movie producer.
Right. Corman made a fortune producing incredibly cheap, highly profitable movies, and he needed people who could work fast and cheap.
And Coppola basically becomes his ultimate utility player.
He does. Corman has him dubbing and re-editing a Soviet sci-fi film into a monster movie. Eventually, Coppola is working as a sound man for Corman in Ireland on a film called The Young Racers.
Okay.
Corman realizes he has $20,000 left over in the budget. So he turns to Coppola and says he can use those leftover funds to shoot a cheap horror film.
So Coppola just stays up, writes the draft for Dementia 13 in a single night, and shoots his first legitimate feature film in 9 days.
Yep.
It is just pure, unadulterated bootstrapping.
It really is. But if we connect this to the bigger picture, that scrappy do-it-yourself survivalism breeds a very specific kind of confidence. It convinces Coppola that he does not need the traditional Hollywood system,
Right.
which leads directly to his attempt to subvert that system entirely by creating his own independent studio in San Francisco, American Zoetrope.
The warehouse utopia. He wants to produce mainstream hits to fund offbeat experimental projects. But that independence blows up in his face almost immediately, doesn't it?
Oh, it is a massive financial disaster. By 1970, American Zoetrope is $400,000 in debt to Warner Brothers.
Ouch.
Yeah. A film Coppola produced and George Lucas directed, THX 1138, it went over budget. And the studio absolutely hated the experimental scripts Zoetrope was developing. They demanded their money back.
Okay, let's unpack this for a second. Because this massive debt is the specific catalyst that forces him into making a movie he actively despised.
Right.
The crushing leverage the studios held over independent creatives meant he had to take a job he thought was completely beneath him just to keep the lights on.
Exactly. So Paramount Pictures held the rights to a novel by Mario Puzo called The Godfather. It was popular, but Paramount viewed it purely as a cheap pulp asset.
They didn't want to spend real money on it.
Not at all. Several other directors had already turned it down. They offered it to Coppola, and he initially gave it a hard pass. He called the book sleazy, sensationalist, and pretty cheap stuff.
But the bank is knocking on the door of his utopia. He is on the verge of losing his entire company, so he has to swallow his pride.
Yeah.
The sources say he takes the job for $125,000 and 6% of the gross. But I mean, how does a director force himself to make a movie out of source material he thinks is trash?
By fundamentally changing the core value of the asset, Coppola elevates the material conceptually. He decides this cannot just be a B-movie about organized crime and mob violence.
Right.
He uses the mafia as a dark, sweeping metaphor for American capitalism. He takes a pulp novel and engineers it into a Greek tragedy about corporate succession.
That's wild. His approach wasn't just directing, it was almost like a hostile corporate takeover.
That's exactly what it was.
He takes Paramount's cheap property, completely rebrands it, and walks away owning the market. But the sources make it very clear that executing this vision was a daily psychological war with the studio.
Oh, Paramount hated almost every artistic decision he made. They hated his cinematographer, Gordon Willis's lighting, which was famously dark and heavily shadowed, completely breaking all the rules of conventional Hollywood lighting. And they despised his casting choices.
Yeah.
They wanted established stars like Ernest Borgnine or Danny Thomas for the lead. Coppola desperately wanted Marlon Brando.
I was looking at the stipulations the studio executives forced on him regarding Brando, and they are shocking.
Oh, they're
They
brutal.
explicitly told him Brando would never appear in the picture. And when Coppola literally begged, they humiliated Brando by forcing him to work for a fraction of his usual fee, submit to a demeaning screen test, and put up a personal financial bond guaranteeing he wouldn't cause production delays.
It's crazy. Coppola was shooting what would become one of the greatest masterpieces in cinema history, living in constant, agonizing terror that he was going to be fired before lunch.
Wow.
He had 2 young children, a third born during the shoot, and they were living in a small apartment. Every single day was a battle for survival against the studio executives.
The irony is just staggering. It's like taking a miserable fast food job just to pay off your debts and accidentally inventing the Big Mac.
Yeah.
The movie that cemented his legacy as a titan of cinema was this begrudging, terrifying compromise.
But the phenomenal success of The Godfather fundamentally rewired the power dynamics of Hollywood. I mean, it didn't just break box office records, it won Best Picture.
Right.
Suddenly, Coppola transitions overnight from a terrified, in-debt director to the most powerful filmmaker in the industry. Paramount's terror tactics inadvertently created a monster.
Because once The Godfather gave Coppola a blank check, he basically vowed to never, ever be controlled by a studio executive again.
Exactly.
Which brings us into the mid-70s. This is the era of absolute unchecked power.
It is an unprecedented winning streak. In 1974, he releases a brilliant, paranoid surveillance thriller called The Conversation, which wins the Palme d'Or at Cannes.
And in that exact same year, he uses his leverage to force Paramount to do something they thought was commercial suicide. He invents the modern Hollywood-numbered sequel with The Godfather Part II. The studio hated the idea of putting Part II in the title because the conventional wisdom at the time was that audiences would just stay away, assuming they had already seen the story.
But he forces it through anyway.
And it wins 6 Oscars.
Yeah.
He is completely untouchable.
But this raises a really important question, though. What happens when a visionary director who is obsessed with absolute control is given unlimited resources and zero oversight? It leads directly to the hubris of the jungle. Coppola decides to adapt Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, setting it during the Vietnam War and creating Apocalypse Now.
And this is where the scale of his ambition just completely shatters reality. You look at Coppola in the Philippines and you really have to ask yourself, at what point does artistic dedication cross the line into a dangerous, self-destructive obsession?
Right. I mean, he takes his massive new wealth and power and pours it into a production that becomes a masterclass in resource bloat.
Yeah.
He later admitted the problem with striking clarity. He said, "We were in the jungle, there were too many of us, we had access to too much money, too much equipment, and little by little we went insane."
And reading the sources, the chaos sounds entirely fictional. Like a typhoon literally destroys the sets.
Yep.
The lead actor, Martin Sheen, suffers a heart attack on location and is given his last rites. Marlon Brando shows up completely unprepared and massively overweight, forcing Coppola to shoot him mostly in shadows just to hide his physique.
It gets worse. You have Philippine military helicopters supplied by a dictator, but the pilots would literally leave in the middle of a scene to go fight actual rebel insurgents.
Wait, what?
Yeah, and there's the real ritualistic killing of a water buffalo caught on film. And then the darkest controversy.
Okay.
The production team illegally hired a local grave robber to supply real human corpses to use as props around Brando's compound.
Wait, actual human corpses?
Literally, until the local police intervened and confiscated the bodies.
I am struggling to reconcile this. It's like Captain Ahab chasing Moby Dick, right? He's willing to destroy himself, his crew, and his sanity just to capture his vision. How does a guy who gets strong-armed by Paramount over Marlon Brando's contract just a few years earlier turn around and strong-arm the entire Philippine military, weather systems, and his own cast?
It's wild.
And more importantly, how do you even make a cohesive movie out of that level of absolute chaos?
Well, you have to remember his training.
The salvage mechanic.
Exactly. The only reason Apocalypse Now exists as a masterpiece is because Coppola fell back on the salvage mechanics he learned working on Corman's B-movies. He had millions of feet of chaotic, disconnected footage.
Right.
So he spent nearly 3 years in the editing room, using that Soviet montage theory, colliding disparate images of helicopters, ceiling fans, and jungle fires to manufacture a psychological narrative out of the wreckage.
He treated this massive, bloated epic with the exact same survivalist editing techniques he used to save that discarded softcore Western back in 1962.
Yes.
That is incredible.
And it works. I mean, it wins him a second Palme d'Or. But the psychological and financial toll is devastating. The sheer hubris he developed surviving the jungle breaks his golden phase and leads directly into the financial ruin of the 1980s.
Because his ambition once again outstrips his resources. Let's look at One from the Heart in 1982. This is where the pendulum swings entirely in the other direction.
Right.
After surviving the uncontrollable reality of the Philippine jungle, he suddenly wants absolute clinical control.
He decides to shoot a Las Vegas set musical fantasy entirely on magnificent, wildly expensive sound stages at his newly purchased Zoetrope Studios.
Oh boy.
He tries to pioneer cutting-edge video editing techniques, essentially trying to direct the movie live from a high-tech control vehicle he called the Silverfish.
It sounds like the ultimate million-dollar version of his childhood bedroom puppet theater.
It really is.
He wants to control every single light bulb and camera angle without dealing with the real world. But the cost is astronomical. The sources say it balloons to $26 million.
And the mechanism of his downfall is that he personally guaranteed the bank loans to maintain his independence from the studios.
Oh, no.
So when One from the Heart grosses a disastrous $636,000, it doesn't just fail, it bankrupts him. He is forced to sell his 23-acre studio to pay the debts.
So we enter this tragic, decades-long cycle. He builds these beautiful, independent utopias to escape the studio system. He goes completely bankrupt, chasing his massive artistic visions.
Oh, yeah.
And then he is repeatedly forced to run right back to the corporate studio system to bail himself out.
Yeah, for the rest of the 1980s and into the 90s, the visionary who fought the system becomes its highest-end employee.
Right.
He directs films like The Outsiders, Rumblefish, Peggy Sue Got Married, and Tucker.
Right.
He is working constantly, but the profits are going straight to Chase Manhattan Bank.
Which completely explains the bizarre nature of his 90s output.
Yeah.
It always confused me why a master of cinema would direct a critically panned, sentimental studio comedy like Jack with Robin Williams. Or why he would make The Godfather Part III in 1990 when he and Mario Puzo always maintained the story ended perfectly with Part II.
Well, he openly admitted on a DVD commentary that he only accepted Paramount's long-standing offer to make a third Godfather because of the dire financial situation caused by the bankruptcy. He needed the money.
Wow.
And that desperation invited harsh criticism, particularly when he cast his own daughter, Sofia Coppola, in a leading role after Winona Ryder dropped out at the last minute. He was a compromised artist working under studio leverage once again.
So how does a guy trapped in this cycle of debt and studio control finally break out? I mean, if making movies is what keeps bankrupting him, what is the exit strategy?
The exit strategy is vertical integration outside of Hollywood. He realizes that if he wants to make art without interference, he cannot rely on studio funding.
Yeah. So where does the money come from?
We have to rewind to 1975. Using the massive profits he made from the first Godfather, Coppola had purchased a portion of the historic Inglenook Winery estate in California's Napa Valley.
Ah, the wine.
Yes. Over the decades, while he was making studio films to pay off his movie debts, the wine business was quietly growing. By the 2000s, he transforms this into a massive, highly lucrative lifestyle brand. Francis Ford Coppola presents.
It's an entire empire.
Exactly.
I mean, he opens luxury boutique resorts in Belize, Guatemala, and Italy. He opens Cafe Zoetrope in San Francisco. He co-founds a literary magazine. And as we mentioned at the start, he even launches a cannabis brand in 2018 called the Growers Series, packaged in a mock black wine bottle. It is a brilliant structural hack. The winery wasn't a celebrity side gig, it was his very own banking system.
It bought him the ultimate luxury in Hollywood, the ability to refuse the factory. After adapting The Rainmaker in 1997, he basically said he was done being a professional director.
Wow.
Once the wine and resorts made him hundreds of millions of dollars, he publicly stated he was no longer interested in making modern factory movies or participating in the superhero business because he didn't need their leverage anymore. He used his independent wealth to re-edit his old films exactly the way he originally intended, releasing Apocalypse Now Redux and The Cotton Club Encore.
You know, it completely flips the concept of selling out on its head. Did Coppola sell out by making branded wine and selling weed? No.
Not at all.
He figured out that the only way to beat the studios was to become his own studio. The wine was his FU money. And that financial independence is what allowed him to fully self-fund Megalopolis in 2024.
Right. A massive, long gestating passion project about a mega disaster in New York that he had been trying to get made since before 9/11. No studio would touch something so experimental with a massive budget.
But he didn't care.
Exactly. Coppola didn't have to pitch a single executive. He just wrote the check himself, funded entirely by the grapes he planted back in the 70s.
It is the ultimate flex. He finally achieved the total, uncompromising control he had been chasing since he was a kid, making home movies in his bedroom.
And if we look at the totality of what we've discussed, Coppola's legacy is so much more than just the films he left behind. I mean, yes, he revolutionized the gangster genre by turning pulp into prestige. Yes, he proved that sequels could be high art. But more than anything, he redefined the limits of what a director could demand from the machinery of Hollywood. He showcased the absolute peaks of artistic triumph and the terrifying valleys of creative hubris.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener? When you look at his journey from the nudie-cutie salvage jobs to the Philippine jungle, here's a final thought for you to mull over. We always think of Coppola's masterpiece as The Godfather or Apocalypse Now, the moving pictures on the screen. But looking at these sources, you really have to wonder if his ultimate masterpiece is actually the architecture of his own life.
Right.
He built a literal empire of grapes, boutique hotels, and mock wine bottles filled with cannabis just so he would never, ever have to take notes from a studio executive again.
It's amazing.
It asks you to consider what unconventional, entirely separate mountains would you be willing to climb just to secure your own total independence. Because in the end, the guy who started out splicing together discarded film scraps to survive didn't really change his hustle. He just found a much, much better way to fund it.